Larry Stowell from Pace Turf. Welcome to ATC Office Hours.
Hi, Micah. How things going?
Going very good. I've been getting quite a few questions about the turfgrass growth potential, and I can answer them, but then I wonder sometimes about the origins of the turfgrass growth potential, and I thought, wouldn't it be great if you could join me in office hours and we could have a discussion about how you came up with this idea that people all over the world make great use of for so many things now.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's interesting, and of course, we've discussed this also just even a few minutes ago that this is not the idea is not super unusual, but making it workable for people to be more accessible, I think, is what we did with growth potential, because people have known how turfs respond to temperature for a long time. But let me describe how I ended up getting involved, trying to figure out why certain grasses grow better at certain times of the year. And this slide with the high-low desert is where
Oh,
that work
let
was.
let me let me show your
Oh,
slide, Larry.
sure. Okay.
So I'm gonna bring up a presentation that you have, and because some people will listen to this later as a podcast,
Okay.
you'll
We'll have to
please
describe everything. Okay.
so describe in words what you're showing here, which
Okay.
people will be able to watch this later in the recorded version also. And
Sure.
by the way, if anybody has questions, we should be able to see them in the chat here. So go ahead and write and say hello or ask some questions, and we'll try to answer those as we can.
All right. Yeah. So what I'm showing here is the high-low desert of California, Palm Springs area, and they overseed their warm season grasses in the fall every year, and then that has to transition into the cool season grasses. Then it transitions back to warm season during the summer, and it's always been a struggle in that area to um, make the best opportunities on how to get that done. And there's a lot of courses out there, hundreds of courses out there, and they don't all overseed at exactly the same time. Mainly because people have different events at different times, so there's a staggered performance or is overseeding time in those areas. And this photo here is of the Springs Country Club that illustrates wall-to-wall overseeding and how beautiful these courses look in the winter. I mean, just dark green ryegrasses are fantastic. But to get them to that stage and fast enough is always a challenge. Now, in this photograph, this is a Greg Norman course at PGA West. And what this illustrates is a December image of the course where there's a driving range that has the target greens that have been overseeded, and the rest is almost white. And then the rest of the fairways, just the target fairways, not the roughs, are overseeded, and everything is dark green and beautiful looking, except that non-overseeded portion of the driving range. This next photo is from June, which what it's showing is that the cool season grasses are fading away. The warm season grasses are starting to get established. It's a very splotchy look. That driving range that was almost perfectly white before is now starting to turn green. And then by August, the course looks great again. I mean, the warm season fairways are lush and green. The driving range is now completely green. And this cycle begins. They start over again, and then you have to get it back into December to where really they want to have these facilities in as good a condition as possible by Thanksgiving. So everybody wants to get there at the same time, but they can't do it because sometimes it's warm and the overseed hits the ground when the Bermuda grass starts growing again. Even though they are using turf lawn and a lot of products to burn that Bermuda down, it sometimes is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
We looked at sort of
So
started out looking at where these are, how cool and warm season grasses grow. And this is a graph that's going to look a lot like you'll see our growth potential graphs from DePaulo and Beard in the this agronomy monograph. Man, it was published a long time ago too. There's going to be a new version pretty soon. Back in '92.
yep, I think there's a 2014.
Right. I think there's another one on the shelf. But anyway, this takes you back. And you look at these graphs and you kind of go, okay, we should be able to model that. And they look to me like a standard normal distribution or a bell-shaped curve that many of you have heard about in school. So we could take a little bit of time and just actually by trial and error a bit, trying to pin down what we wanted to use for the mean, which will be the optimum growth temperature, for cool and warm season grasses, and then looking at a variation. The variance determines how well that's spread out. And Micah wrote something about this in his blog just recently. And this is what we started with, and we used this for many years. Micah provided a modification because he felt that there really wasn't a point at when warm season grasses start to turn down in the growth
Larry,
temperature.
Larry, there is, but it's not a temperature that you really hit on the planet Earth. And
Right. Well,
so,
we get some. Well, I agree. We get some 125-degree days out here, so there's some places maybe, but it's not. It's insignificant. So I agree that this is an easy way to look at it. And I think it works out pretty well. Although I'm not 100% sure that all of the graphs I'll show have implemented this change. So this gives us an idea for any temperature, what we think the growth of the plant might be relative to its maximum potential. That's why I call it growth potential. And this is the equation to if you wanted to calculate it yourself. This you can find on many handouts that we have out there. So there's really no reason for you to memorize this or anything, but this is just there for your knowledge. Okay, this to remind you. Now, when we take this type of data, we can move from location to location because this is about as simple a model as you can get. It's just average air temperature and a standard deviation. So now we can go to any location throughout the year and compare how turf grasses might grow. So we're still looking at a pretty basic model. And what this illustrates, if we come over here around, there's two graphs showing for people on the podcast. One warm season graph that peaks in July, and then the cool season graphs that have two peaks, one in around November and the other around March. So the graphs cross over in around October in the fall. That's when there's the maximum amount of competition between cool season and warm season grasses, and any weather modifications that favor either cool or warm season grasses will influence the success of the overseed going into the fall. So this is going to be dictated by weather conditions at that time.
Larry, I'm going to pause you
Sure.
for a second, and just you're explaining how this works, and I think I have the question: is this like just you were trying to solve the problem, right? I mean, like, I'm just like, where do you get this idea? Because nobody had tried to express this before, and then all of a sudden you introduced this, and I'm just wondering, 25 years ago or so, when you were working on this, was it like you were dealing with overseeding challenges?
Right. This was used as a communication tool to support the superintendents in the desert areas during years when environmental conditions, it's usually in the fall, were inappropriate for overseeding on the early side. So what happened if you overseeded before the warm season grasses started to shut down, you would end up with a very thin overseed, and we were providing explanations to our clients in that area to help them explain to golfers why the environment was not suitable for overseeding. The same sort of thing happened in the transition. If you couldn't get the turf back by mid-June, then people would start complaining also. There's still some people are playing golf out in the desert, at 110 degrees, at least in the mornings. So this was all designed to begin with to support superintendents in transition environments that were having problems with their overseeds. And then also,
so really,
just one more thing. And then also the transition out, we needed to have about 1,300. Well, we'll show that in a minute. You needed to have enough warm season growth before you applied a transition accelerator like Revolver. Otherwise, you'd end up with sort of dirt for 3 or 4 weeks. So as a triggering that transition removal program in the spring was also critical.
Cool. I just think it's it's something that people use for so many things now, and I think it's interesting how something that you came up with to look at that specific competition, basically the not even for the entire year, but really just at the time where those lines cross, where the cool season grass and the warm season grass have similar growth potentials. You designed it, or you had the idea to make this calculation for those particular seasons. That was the
Well, it
origin, right?
yeah, well, it just so happened that if you can roughly model the growth of the species, you can do a bunch of stuff, which I really hadn't. You expanded our use of it when we started talking about nutrient management and uh,
I
and growth
Yeah.
potential. But this was
I don't
mainly
think
mainly
I don't think I think when I was in grad school we would have talked about this, but I'm sure you had the idea uh, to say that as the grass grows more, it uses more nutrients.
I'm pretty sure you had that idea. They said
Well,
maybe we can tie nitrogen into this thing, and it's sort of like, oh, okay. And
yeah,
that then and
maybe.
the way you do that is if you get maximum growth, there's a ton of literature out there that suggests that for cool season grasses, more than a pound of N per thousand isn't going to get you much, or anything above that. And then in some cases, that sort of levels out at 2 pounds on warm season grasses, but it's a little iffy there if that's actually that much required. So you can use the proportional numbers from growth potential to just get a rough idea going through the year. And it does not work very well on like a daily basis. This is good for planning, but things like clipping volume are the ones that are going to tell you how to really do a better job managing nitrogen. And Soldat and his crew are working on that. And the model it's a really good like monthly planning model, and gives you some rough ideas during the weeks of the year. But it's not great for detail work because there's so many factors involved in why a turf is performing well: sunlight, water, traffic, all those other things are involved. This is just looking at the potential for growth. This isn't looking at what you're going to expect because all those other factors are involved in that.
But yeah, but it's such a cool way to isolate the potential effect of temperature and express that in a way that can be used for a lot of different things. So
Oh, turf grass types, recommendations whether to overseed or not overseed in some locations are all part of it.
cool. All right. Well, we have Grant from New Zealand and Paul from Ireland and Valerio from Italy who have all joined us from different time zones. So, hello, everybody. If anybody has any questions, we should see questions from those watching on YouTube, and leaving any questions in the chat. I don't know if we see anything from people watching this on Twitter. The questions from Facebook should show up too. So if anybody has questions or comments or wants to say hello from another time zone, please do so, and that should show up in the chat. All right, Jason, hello. One of the coolest models in turfgrass management. All right, everybody, thanks for
Hi,
joining us.
Jason.
And Larry, go ahead and keep showing us this, and that
All right,
it's
just break in whenever
fascinating.
anybody has any questions. This is now there's two major ways you can represent growth potential. That's as a proportion from 0 to 1, or as a percentage. I use percentage a lot. Micah prefers proportions, so just divide this by 100 if you want to bring that into terms that Micah prefers better. But this is just to look at, give you an example of transition in the spring over a number of years. I don't know why I don't have the years on here. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and it ranged from the end of March till the beginning of May, when the Bermuda grass reached the level where you could comfortably use a transition accelerator like Revolver or any of those transition accelerators to get good response out of the Bermuda. Because if you blew out the cool season back here in March, you might have 8 weeks before you got up to the point where you got 80% recovery of the Bermuda. So that was one of the practical sides of trying to use these models. So you can get an idea: is can I get my transition accelerator out there now, or do I need to wait?
And
This Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's good. You can look at what's happened in past years and try say, and then you can say that on average, you'll reach a certain threshold by such and such date on average, and you can even put some bounds on that and say it's gonna. We expect it to fall within these dates, and work on
Right.
timing that way.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. You can really bend it around quite a bit. It's pretty easy. This is a look from September through sort of the end of October for the transition going in to the cool season grasses, and you can see there's quite a range in accumulated growth potential. And I'm not sure what the exact number is for cool season grasses when it's dropped, but you can tell that if you the earlier you put it on, depending on the year, the more trouble you're going to have. Where in 2003, this was just a bad year, and you can see it got what happened with this 1998 year. You see how it shot up just like crazy. It probably got cold. So in this case,
Hmm.
if you had not put your seed down early, you're going to probably see quite a bit of funky looking Bermuda sticking up as it's going dormant. But there's just a multitude of ways of looking at it. This is looking at sort of the same thing with the cool season, and you can see going into the year that coming out. This is going from January through June. When these curves start to inflect, that's when the cool season grass is no longer in its optimum growing period. And you see that starts to happen back in May some years, and in 2001, it just didn't really do well. That was just a cooler year. It was more favorable for cool season grasses, more difficult to transition back to the Bermuda base. And another way you can look at these things, which we did, was we took the difference between cool season minus the warm season, and then you just accumulate those numbers. And as the cool season continues to dominate, and this is a graph going up, uh, continuing to accumulate the cool season growth potential, you hit a point where the temperatures begin to favor the warm season grasses, and that curve starts to descend down, and that's when you'll
Yep.
start to see the transition occur. And in
And
some cases, go ahead.
yeah, this is the difference between the cool and warm season growth potential. So Larry's showing this one is cool minus warm. So when that is going up, uh, I think
That's cool season dominating.
yeah, and then it reaches an inflection point and the line suddenly changes direction, and that's kind of a trigger for when the other species is going to do better.
Yeah, that's the crossover point for that year.
Yeah, I think that might be warm minus cool, Larry.
Nope, it's cool minus warm. You see, this is March. Cool season's still growing, 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 growing,
Oh,
growing
that
out, and
I've
then this is yeah,
I have terrible eyes. I thought it was August.
nope.
I see that.
Yeah, yeah, it's March. Yeah, and then that just gives us the ability to compare, and we know areas of the country like in the low desert, Palm Springs, this type of a combination of growth potential where you have rapid growth of cool season grasses in the fall and the spring, and rapid season growth of warm season grasses in the summer, is suitable for an overseeding environment. That allows us to look at other areas, such as Orlando, Florida, where it's not as clear how you would manage that. We know that overseeding is not going to be something that will be used down there, but certainly the warm season grasses are going to have some performance problems in the winter. That's kind of a tough one. Uh, Manila, Philippines. This is like Micah's region. It's just dominated all of the time by warm season grasses.
And we have Gary joining us from the Philippines. Magandang umaga, Gary.
Yeah, and then we got places like Dublin, Ireland, which I mean, it's silly to even put the warm season grass on here, but you see that their cool season grasses don't get even close to the optimums that we see in other locations. That's why maybe brown top is more popular. Things that will grow better in lower temperatures. And these, you could imagine that that mean and variance, if you really wanted to dial it in, you would adjust it to your location, maybe based on clipping volume. After some recording some data that would support that, but you can dial it in a little bit better.
That's so. What do you think about changing the optimum temperature for Poa annua? I know some people adjust that down to 18 degrees Celsius or something like that. Where for creeping bent grass and ryegrass, we typically find it works really good at about 20.
Yeah, I think that's why we left the two parameters that define the function are there on the climate appraisal spreadsheets, and you can take that equation and move it to anything else. But I think Jason was one of the first ones who started making some adjustments. Jason Haynes, who started making some adjustments in those parameters. Yeah, and then these are the types of environments that are nightmarish, that nobody dominates. This is shows a graph of a cool season graph with two peaks in the spring and fall, and a trough in the middle of the summer, and then the warm season grasses just have a kind of a funky lump in the middle of the summer that overlaps barely with the cool season grasses. So overseeding in that environment, and this is true, is difficult. You can to maintain, if you want to have warm season grasses because your water quality is bad or you have drought issues and cost of water is going up, you can be sure you're going to have troubles during the fall and winter of the year. So you know that, then you can plan ahead on what you're going to do. This is something Micah was over here. When was that? Must have been 3-4 years ago.
Oh,
And
Larry, it was maybe
5
years ago. Yeah, these are the GP avatars, and that is still a Shiny app where you can get that, or I think you can download that. All the Pace Turf members can download that.
Right, this is all available. You can, yeah, we should move that over to your Shiny area. I think the database has some issues we might want to modify too. But yeah, this is good because this just shows you that there's quite a range of environments at the universities that conduct research that you're depending on to make decisions in golf turf management. So you might want to focus, or at least understand when you're reading the research, what type of growth environment is available to you to compare with your location. Of course, everybody likes to go to the university that's nearby, but you have locations that are really active, Wisconsin, Rutgers, North Carolina, that put out a little bit more than some of the others, that you might want to just consider how their data matches up with the growth potential at your location. So this is one. We'll just take a second on this. We'll talk about validation, because there's lots of ways you can validate these models. And one of the ways you can do it is you can look at your clipping yield, your location based on the average temperature, and figure out if it's working for you or not, and how close it is, and what caveats you might need to impose on the model. But this is looking at Beavers and Cooper. This is from 1964, where it's a growth chamber study. And this is when we're talking about growth potential. We're talking about what is the potential for a cool season grass to go with no restrictions, has all the water, all the light, all the air movement it needs, all the nitrogen, everything. How fast will it grow? Only altering temperature. And so what they did is they took some 3 different day and night temperature regimes, because that's a more realistic way to look at how a plant would grow in nature. They maintained the relative humidity between 65 and 75. They gave them 650 foot candles of light. Do you know what that turned? Let's see, that's 908 watts per meter square. What's the DLI on that? It's way over what they need.
That's a lot.
Well, there it is, 41 moles per meter square. And they harvested leaves at a 1/4 inch above the soil surface and measured the leaf area. And from that study, this is a graph showing that there was less growth at an average temperature of about 54. It grew the best at 65 and less at 77. So it shows a definite peak in growth at temperatures around 65 is what they used here. And if we look at the growth potential expectation based on the model the standard 68 degrees and variance at 10, model, you see we get different temperatures that sort of look like they're right. But if you run the regression on that, we got an R square of 0.97. So that's just one actual look at how you can compare, but it doesn't take long, I think, to just watching growth potential and watching what's happening out in the grass to get pretty convinced that it's roughly giving you some decent numbers.
Yeah, Larry. John suggests that you make the university GP chart a NFT, a
Oh my God! There you go.
non-fungible token. So that could be good, and yeah, then you can come fly, make a lot of money from that, and come fly first class to come visit me in Thailand, and we'll have another live coding session to come up with something new. Yeah, I think that's right. You're showing some of those charts and looking at some research to kind of prove that this is realistic. Jason had a comment. He said this was the aha moment for me. So much research about how turfgrass grows was done in a much warmer climate than what I grow grass in. It was nice to validate my observations with this model. That was a comment that he just shared, and I think that's right. It's so cool how you can take temperature data from your site and convert that essentially into a curve that shows your growing season. And what you find is that in the textbooks, it always shows that cool season grass has this big dip in the summer because the temperatures are supra optimal for cool season grass growth. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe in Atlanta, the summer is so intense that the temperatures are too high for cool season grass growth. But if you're in Saskatchewan or if you're in Edmonton or something, I don't think the temperatures are. The temperatures in midsummer would be your peak growing season, and you wouldn't have these peaks in spring and fall anymore. Your peak would be in midsummer, and growth potential now. It allows you to generate this in the northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, high elevation, low elevation, anywhere, just kind of looking at how it works for your site. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it worked pretty good. Well, then that was then you got. I still think it was your idea, tying in with the nitrogen requirements. And this, we just went. Well, we just went back to Gustav Soldau's, Kreuzer and Houlihan's work, and you look at nitrogen pretty much drives the bus. You put more nitrogen on and you're going to take out more phosphorus and potassium. It's roughly an 8 to 1 to 4 N to P to K, or 4 to 1 to 2 N to K2O to P2O5, phosphate and potash. And then we know roughly the clipping concentrations, which we can vary those. And then I think the latest climate appraisal, I think, has there's a sheet that you can change these on there, so you can change these assumptions also to get a better read on what the requirements are for the grass. And that's just so we get that kind of proportional thing. And then this is where we married up those two ideas of growth potential and MLSN and nutrient requirements to try to keep soil levels above the MLSN, knowing that the plants are going to grow and extract nutrients from the soil, how much fertilizer you're going to have to apply to match it up to what you think you're going to be taking out. So it gives you actually some kind of a logical way to plan out a year in a kind of scientific way. And this is just an example. This is the Talega golf course, and this is another way.
This is the climate appraisal form that you can get at the Pace Turf website, and you can download the spreadsheet, and you can do that for metric or for United States customary units based calculations.
This is really an old one. It didn't even have the option to change the standard deviation. But anyway, this is basically how it works, where it shows you the growth potential through the year. It gives you an estimate of nitrogen requirement by month, and it also provides you, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium levels that you think that the model says you might possibly need. And then at the right side there, it shows the soil parts per million that are going to be in deficit. So like we look at this phosphorus It says it's going to take 25 parts per million per year, roughly, in this environment to grow cool season grass. And I just gave a presentation like this like yesterday too, but this is a photograph of Bermuda grass overseeded with ryegrass next a collar next to an A4 green that's looking kind of punky. It's kind of off color. The Bermuda grass and the ryegrass gets a starter fertilizer every time they overseed in the fall. So that's received tons of phosphorus and potassium all through the time. They withhold any phosphorus applications to the green since the green was constructed. So nothing went on that green. And of course, after 8 or 9 years, you start to pull off all the phosphorus in the soil, and they saw that the leaves went purple. And to try to get an idea of what's going on, we looked at their trends in soil phosphorus, MELIC3 soil phosphorus, and it started out at 150 parts per million in 2000, and then this is only 5 years. And by 2005, it had dropped down below the MLS guideline at 21 parts per million, and that's when we saw the effect. And then with a simple knockout trial where you put a board, I think this is a 2x3 piece board, then they applied half a pound of monoammonium phosphate, 2 applications, would expect it to possibly bring the soil P levels up 7 parts per million from where it was before the application. The turf where the fertilizer was not applied still looks unthrifty and purple due to the phosphorus deficits. Then if you compare the soil test between the treated and non-treated areas, make a note the pH is 7.5. This is a reminder that our MLSN guidelines, there's a couple of ways of looking at phosphorus in the guidelines. The phosphorus for Olsen P is set at 6 parts per million. That's the extraction system you would use for high pH soils for phosphorus. And the MELIC3 phosphorus, when the pH is a normal below 7.5, is set at 21 parts per million. When we looked at the results, we find that the collar samples came in at about 40 parts per million using MELIC3 extraction, which is not ideal for the high pH conditions. The non-treated and the treated areas both came in a little bit above 21. They're just like right on the edge of the MLSN guidelines. But if we look at the Olsen extraction system, we're hoping to see a 7 part per million increase. We didn't see it. It's maybe it's in the thatch, or we just didn't get it down there yet. But the Olsen P for the collar areas, which are thriving, was at about 14 parts per million. We only need 6, and you don't expect a response after that. The non-treated was down at 2 or 3, and the treated came up to about 4, and a significantly higher level of phosphorus on the Olsen that we couldn't pick up in the MELIC3. But I mean, when you're talking about differences in 7 parts per million, it's not sometimes not that easy. But the bottom line was that the 2 applications of phosphorus return the turf to healthy conditions. So we know it was a phosphorus deficiency. It only happened when we dipped below the MLSN guidelines. So it's another confirmation that, those guidelines are pretty solid. And phosphorus, like nitrogen, you can just put it on and turn the turf around pretty quick. But if you're starting to get down near that 21 parts per million guideline, you might have to put on more phosphorus. Some locations and some data from Soldat and other researchers are showing you can really drive it down a lot lower than 21 parts per million. So with phosphorus, and this is, I think, the recommendation that a lot of people have been doing, is like you just don't put any phosphorus on until you see a deficit. It's like nitrogen. You run it the same way. If the turf is growing too slow, then you put some phosphorus on. So you can control turf growth with phosphorus the same way you control it with nitrogen. That sort of idea. I think, Mike, you probably agree with that. I'm not sure.
I think that's pretty risky, and I only recommend that for advanced turfgrass management because the thing with phosphorus is the turf. It's difficult to see sometimes, especially like with warm season grass. So I get massive differences in growth, massive differences in growth from adding or not adding phosphorus, except the leaves look normal, the plant structure looks normal. It's just not growing. And I think you, at the very least, you should test the soil to find out if you're in that zone or not. And if
Yeah,
you know that you're really low, if you know that you're really low, and then you can play around with it like that. But I just I it doesn't make sense to me globally. I think it might work
yeah,
fine for bank grass in a certain region, but globally to say let's just visually assess phosphorus deficiency, it's not really the way that I recommend managing, because as you and I have talked about, soil tests are so affordable and they're so accurate that you can assess what the situation is and make better decisions that way, I think.
yeah.
There's a couple questions here. John asks if these ideas are being taught in turf schools around the world. This is the hurdle to wider adoption, he thinks. I suppose it's not taught a lot, but textbooks are tough to read sometimes, and I don't know why people don't write about things like this that are so practical and that they make sense to people and they work. I, I suppose people tend to stick with traditional textbooks that don't have a lot of discussion like this. But I mean, I, I'll take a slight divergence here, and I've got my copy of Turfgrass Science and Culture by James Beard, which is kind of the classic turfgrass textbook. So this describes this. I'm gonna stop sharing your screen, Larry, so we can see ourselves here looking larger. And in this book, there's a temperature section, and it lists in the temperature section, which is on page 217 of my copy. It says what those optimum temperature ranges are, and then if you get to the end of the temperature section, it says common sense things like the optimum temperature ranges refer to shoot growth over an extended period of time. Shoot growth is actually more rapid at higher temperatures when measured for only a short period of 2 to 3 weeks. And it just goes on and on with all kinds of things that we explain again and again about growth potential, about how the optimum temperatures, they don't work on like an hourly basis or a daily basis to be exact, but they work really good when you look at it on over a long period of time. And there's statements like that in these kind of textbooks that then growth potential comes out and explains it in a way that anybody can use. And I would hope that some people somewhere are teaching this, but fortunately in the modern world, people can watch YouTube or listen to this as a podcast or something, or go to the Pace Turf or Asian Turfgrass Center website to get all kinds of reads and views. And I think the ideas then get learned that way also. So hopefully some people will teach this in turf schools also.
I have to apologize to Grant Saunders about metric units versus U.S. units.
Yeah, he asked if this is going to be rebroadcast with metric units. I think anybody that wants metric units can usually find both on the Pace Turf discussions of this, and on the Asian Turfgrass Center website, there's various things about growth potential, and it's kind of concentrated in the metric focus.
That's a rough spot here. Why we're still using U.S. units, we never will. We'll never understand.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can make the calculations either way. It's just metric is a little bit easier, but once you know the United States standard units, those work too. Let's see.
Well,
Carl's
we have
got a question. Let me see what Carl is asking. Carl is asking, would you say that mindset of wanting to know the phosphorus in the soil with a soil test instead of just visually assessing changes based on the turf system? And he's asking if that's golf turf versus lawns. Um, it doesn't really for me, because generally we want to avoid phosphorus applications
Right.
on any kind of turf. We want to avoid phosphorus applications unless there's a demonstrated need for that phosphorus. And I think that if you have reduced growth in lawns, for example, so you could say, well, lawns are probably have enough phosphorus, so let's not test for it and let's just visually assess it. And so let's just say that we're going to skip phosphorus on lawns. But then if you don't have enough growth, you're going to have more weed pressure, because the turf would be thinner. So I think it makes sense to test, maybe not so often. I think you can test every 3 years or something if you want to minimize testing. But for any kind of turf area, it makes sense to me to test to know what the phosphorus is.
Yeah, I think, and with the way regulations are going, and I have some slides on that if you want to look at them, but there's been a huge increase in regulations around phosphorus. Also, the cost of phosphorus has gone up like 100%. Uh, Testing for phosphorus is probably more important than most of the nutrients from a regulatory and a cost perspective. But I tell you, one of the things that drives me crazy is out here when they overseed the courses in the desert. Some of the soils are up in the 200 part per million range, and they continuously apply triple 15 at overseed with the concern that they won't have a good starter fertilizer for the ryegrass because they're so worried about that transition failure issue that I think is primarily due to weather conditions that they just keep putting it down. And there's no regulations around this part of the country, especially where you're arid. There's no surface water to contaminate. That just doesn't happen, and it hasn't gotten down into the groundwater yet.
Yeah, I don't know that it's like what Eric just made a comment that
Mm-hmm.
I he said what I heard from other agronomists in San Diego. So I assume he's talking about the recent GCSAA
Mm-hmm.
conference in San Diego. He said from what he heard, growth potential and clipping volume is still underutilized, especially in our region, that's which is kind of like, yeah, the MLSN is widely used all over the world, but not everybody's doing it. So if you're doing phosphorus application when the soil test is at 200 parts per million, you're probably not using growth potential or clipping volume or MLSN. So there's lots of opportunities to optimize turf management with some simple little tools that I think makes it easier to have control of the turfgrass performance. So by having more control, you have opportunities to take advantage of good weather, take advantage of every opportunity you have to have better turfgrass conditions, which is really important. And by having better turfgrass conditions and by being more in control of the situation and understanding things that you can't have control of, I think it makes turfgrass management more fun. So not
Yeah.
only do you get better turfgrass conditions, you can have more fun doing the job. And as a side effect, it tends to use the minimum amount of resources necessary in order to produce those conditions. So that's something that I think you've called precision turfgrass management, which you've written about and talked about quite a bit over the years. Growth, to me, it kind of starts with growth potential, and then it's branched off into so many other things. Like clipping volume is a way to measure what's actually happened, and growth potential is kind of a way to predict it. It's pretty
Right.
cool.
Well, I still thought by now there would have been a lot more sensor technology on the market, um, and on more automation in handling the data. I mean, there's a lot of automation and getting some turf quality data, but it's still not dialed into the point where it's easily usable by the turfgrass manager.
All right, which is, yeah, it's like things like clip vol, measuring how much, how many clippings are produced, how many clippings are harvested when you cut the grass. Every time I talk with, especially people in the US, they always are like, well, can't we get a sensor for this? And it turns out for various reasons that it's been a little bit tricky to get a sensor that works as well as just measuring what the volume is. And it seems like it would be pretty tricky to do, but it turns out to be simple. So,
Well, you can
yeah,
get. I think you could still even NDVI meter on a mower. I think you'd get pretty close to clip volume if they would working it out. I mean, but it's just there's a lot of things that don't get adopted fast in the turf side. We're a little slow. We're pretty far behind ag in just about every aspect of the science. There's not that the funding is not there, so it's not surprising that if there's not that
yeah.
much interest, unfortunately.
The Mr. Johnny on the spot has a comment. I think the slow adoption is mostly due to you can't teach an old dog new tricks. The younger generation seems to be more interested in these ideas. I I I have the great pleasure of having a global audience for the types of things that I write about and the types of people who pay attention to what I'm doing. And so to me, I don't see so much underutilization because by having a global audience, there's so many people around the world, from Italy to New Zealand to Australia to United States, all Asia, Japan. I mean, there's a lot of people in Japan that use growth potential, but because it's in Japanese, most people don't don't know that. I mean, growth potential might be really well known in Japan because I've written so many articles about it that it's quite common for people in Japan just to say GP, and we kind of know what we're talking about. So it's yeah. Mr. Johnny on the spot says it's Alan, and I thought that was Alan, but I didn't want to call you out when you've got a different username in case you're trying to be inconspicuous and incognito.
Anonymous. Yeah.
Eric Johnson says that some of us are young at heart, and I know Eric is definitely an early adopter with some of these things, and I appreciate that, Eric. I'm glad that you do this and give feedback about how they work and whether they're practical or not. And I I suppose most of the things tend to be practical, or we wouldn't keep using them. Giovanni from Italy says, yeah, in Italy they very well know GP, so that's cool. Larry, you want to show something else on your
No, I was just looking if there's anything else here to talk about. Most of the other stuff was uh, no. I think we're good.
cool. Well, we've got about 12 more minutes on this. We're not gonna have a long rambling one that goes on where we discuss this topic for 2 hours, like some of a few of the other office hours have been. Larry and I both have to do another call after this one's finished. But while we still have a few minutes, let's talk about the origins of MLSN, because that's something else that kind of came out of nowhere. And then it's now like the 10-year anniversary of MLSN, and it's come into wide and successful use all around the world. Where did MLSN come from? Can you remember?
Yeah, well, I think that was us talking about it again. How did we come up with it? We decided that the guidelines would work together. I mean, you started it with your potassium work at Cornell, and that always intrigued me. And then we started talking about it because we had all this data laying around. I think I had about
That
twenty
was
thousand
your
data points, and you
yeah,
had
that was
some coming in.
yeah, I think what happened, the way that I remember it is we kept talking about it, and I kept telling you that the conventional guidelines were recommending levels that people were producing good turf in soils that had a lot lower nutrients than what the conventional guidelines said were necessary. So we kept testing soils and getting results where the turf was good, but the soil test interpretation using the conventional guidelines would suggest that the turf needed more nutrients. And
Right.
you
Well,
you were kind of using the conventional guidelines and being conservative in that way, and I kept telling you this isn't right, this isn't right. And then I think it occurred to you, hey, we're sitting on all this data, we've got all this data of what the actual soil test results are from good turf. Let's analyze it. And again, your insight into some of the mathematics that could be applied to that data and expressing it as a distribution and then throwing away the bottom part of it, that that's how I remember it.
yeah, I think that was pretty much it. One of the keys was when I first started working with soils. I started off doing both the soils and the disease diagnostics. All of the data, all of the samples, most of the samples, were coded either exceptional, average, or poor uh, by either me or by the person pulling the samples. So we had metadata to determine whether the samples are from good performing turf or not. So I think that was critical because we had a lot of research, you know, data in the database from, gypsum trials or nitrogen trials or phosphorus trials. And we had all kinds of diagnostic samples in there. So we could throw all that stuff away, which most people, unfortunately, don't code whether their soils are from good or poor performing areas. And we also use the poor performing data to find out what's bad. So we're pretty sure we know what's a bad problem, like sodium at 600 parts per million is bad, that type of thing. But just taking the good samples, then and you plot, if you're doing the normal sort of exploratory work with data, you plot the distribution, see what's the spread of the data, and it's clearly not normal, like growth of turf grass over temperature. It is skewed curve that we could work with. And actually, that distribution is the same one that we use for the nutrient analyses on the GCSAA surveys, because all of the data that we saw from water, everything, it's skewed to the right because there's a few people that use too much. So it makes your data look wrong because you're, as long as you're above the MLSN guideline, you're fine. That means if you're way above it, you're still fine in most cases. So you can have, your data set just tails off to one side. And if you don't take that into account and you just look at the data like it's a normal distribution with a mean and uniformly, shaped around that mean, you overestimate the requirements of the graph of the crop or the turf. And that's what happened with most of the SLAN and the other guidelines coming out of an ag environment, in which case I think those are more normally distributed distributions because they're pushing the high end. We're pushing the low end. We want the low end. They're pushing the high end and sort of around a mean that gives them an adequate yield for per dollar of or unit of nitrogen applied.
Yeah, it's
So we
not
had to
really
just look at it a different way.
it's not so much based on turf grass. And when you read through all the textbooks, they always admit that it's not based on turf grass, and nobody really came up with any new guidelines. People just kept saying this is a problem. It's not based on turf grass, but it's the best we have at the moment. And it just kept on going and going and going. And you realized that we had this data, we had the idea, and then we we did that, and it's amazing. Even I thought some of the MLSN guidelines were a bit too low, and now when we look at it further and we do the global soil survey, it comes up with potassium's lower, calcium's lower, magnesium's lower than what's in the current MLSN. And we will continue to update these. And I think the other cool thing about MLSN is we looked at it for sand root zones where the conventional guidelines are not really based on sand root zones. They're based on agricultural soils and crops. And we realized that high performance turf is produced in sand root zones. And we looked at what the nutrient levels are in what nutrient levels are currently producing good turf in sand root zones, and it's not quite an order of magnitude lower, but it's half or less
Yeah, or
than what
third.
the
Yeah,
conventional guidelines are.
yeah, and they're solid. I mean, it was actually it wasn't an easy project. I mean, it took some work to sort it all out, but and it was a new way, as new approach rather than trying to do a calibration study or looking at deficit studies like the phosphorus study that we looked at just earlier, where that's the bottom line. Yeah, if you run it into a deficit, those things are really difficult to do, and they're going to be very much dependent on the environment. Like you were saying, Doug Soldak can run it down to 7 parts per million phosphorus in his location, and that's fine. May not be that way everywhere. But when you're looking at large numbers of data points, you get more confidence in the result because it takes into account all those things, and we put the 10% buffer on the bottom. So yeah, that's a very delightful study to be able to
Yeah,
pull together.
it's funny. I I should what would it be called? Well, I mean, I still have this email archive of our conversations from back in the winter of 2011 and 12. When we were back and forth, you were using that MathWave software because
Yeah,
I didn't really know how to use R at that time, so I couldn't make the calculations. You were using some software called MathWave to find how the soil test results were distributed and how we could come up with the guidelines. So you were doing the math and the theory. I was kind of doing the theory, and we were just back and forth about how we were working on this. And there's some emails where it's like, okay, this has been a fun project. We don't, we're getting ready to release it. We don't know if
nobody's
anybody, we don't know if anybody is ever going to use this, but at least we have an alternative to this. And then that so many people started using it, getting great results. And I think you had a presentation to a company in a foreign country yesterday about MLSN. I've done consulting projects all around. I mean, for um, various companies around the world using MLSN, and there's lots of soil test interpretation and fertilizer application made based on MLSN now. It's been cool.
Yeah, I think it's pretty solid. Yeah, there's always exceptions. I mean, some of the data I was looking at yesterday was those high aluminum, low pH soils where your decision is you got 120 parts per million phosphorus in the soil. You got a phosphorus absorption index of like 0.05, and the pH is 4.7. What do you do? I mean, do you raise the pH? Do you apply lime, or do you try to keep putting phosphorus on? The first thing you do is you drop a little phosphorus to see if there's a deficiency or not, which is
Yeah,
one of the
yeah.
problems, because
When you get those kind of edge cases, um, then you have to really do some site
right,
specific management, but at least you're working from some kind of common sense and site specific approach. And
right,
you often can't find the answers in a textbook. And I've written hard. I write a monthly column for the magazine in Japan for Golf Course Seminar magazine, and I've been doing that since 2008. So I have to come up with a new topic every month, and it's about a 1,200 word article every month. And my Japanese book is 36 of those articles or so, and it's now up to 100, almost 200 articles, and it's a lot of writing. And I know that when I've summarized some of this, it's like I start the article of like, what do you do when you actually have to go grow grass? What do you have to do when you have to actually go grow grass and the textbook doesn't apply anymore? Because you can't find all the answers in a textbook. And I think growth potential, MLSN, clipping volume, some of these things that we've worked on, that you really have the idea for growth potential. I credit you with the idea for MLSN, with the technical details of how that would work. They they give a chance for anyone in the world to apply a bit of science when they can't refer to the textbook, and but they're still applying a scientific method and a science-based method to site-specific turfgrass management.
Yeah, that's a good starting point. Yeah, you can start to
Yeah,
poke around, and boy, just hopefully people will be encouraged to challenge the data and come up with what works for their site, and don't get locked in. I mean, it's keeping an open mind. I know Jason has pushed some numbers around to make things work better for his site, to adjust things to make it work for you. I mean, there's
yeah. Now he uses the growth
thousands of ways to do
ratio.
it.
So
Yeah.
he uses the growth ratio now, which looks at clipping volume adjusted by the site-specific growth potential over time to get a seasonally optimum growth rate, and he's had great results with that. He's had great results with a number of things related to growth potential. So there's all kinds of ways to apply this. If people want to get more information, you can get it at asianturfgrass.com or at paceturf.com. I think we've talked about a wide range of subjects, but if you search either of those websites for growth potential or MLSN, you will turn up a wealth of reading or viewing material. All right, Larry, I thank you so much for joining me today on Office Hours. For everybody who joined us in the live stream, thank you for getting up early, for joining us during your workday, or for staying up late to watch. And you'll be able to watch this later in various recorded forms, or listen to it later in various recorded forms. And Larry, I think there's all kinds of, what would we say, more things related to this that we could talk about in the future. So maybe you can come back and join me again another time.
Man, I'm going to get you started on soil gases pretty soon and bulk density. That's next.
We've been having a discussion recently about venting and aeration and compaction in the soil, and how much that is a limitation to turfgrass performance or not. And I mentioned that it's a pity that we wouldn't get a chance to talk about that. In fact, I've been so engrossed in talking about growth potential and MLSN that I didn't realize that I'd forgotten that we might talk about that if we had time. Well, we didn't. So
Next time.
Next time, yeah. That's also a very
I still got to
important
formulate
topic.
I got to still formulate my ideas a little bit more around that one anyway.
Yeah, I'll mention Chris Tridabaw's blog, where he's been blogging about disturbance, and I think it's really interesting because he describes the journey that he took from a young golf course superintendent, or even just a golf course maintenance employee, and the types of work that he enjoyed doing and the things that he thought were essential at that time to produce excellent turf. And now, as a more experienced golf course superintendent, how he's kind of changed what he thinks is essential for turfgrass management. It's quite interesting. I think he's got a few more posts about that, so maybe we can talk about that sometime. All right, Larry. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we will catch you next time on the next Office Hours.